COVID pandemic, many of us have embraced what we know as domestic tourism, and it's almost become a bit of a household name. And lots of people who usually would flock to foreign shores had the experience of staying at home and travelling within their own country. Now, whilst for some people this was a temporary measure, in lots of countries it's not. And actually, the domestic industry is the bread and butter of their tourism industry. And in today's video, I'm going to tell you about why domestic tourism is so big, and I'm going to tell you some of the countries where it is really big and where they rely on it so much and why. We're going to look at the good things, the bad things about it too, as always. If you're new here, my name is Dr. Hayley-Stainton, and I'm here to teach you all things travel and tourism. So let's start at the beginning for those of you who do not know, and just explain exactly what do we mean when we use the term domestic tourism. Domestic tourism is the act of travelling for business or leisure within one's home country. According to the United Nations World Tourism Organization, a person must be away from their usual place of residence, but still in their home country, for at least one night to qualify as a domestic tourist. Popular destinations for domestic tourism include the USA, India, and China, and I'll talk a bit more about those later. This is because they are big countries with a variety of tourist experiences to offer. Travelling a few miles away from your home, you don't expect to be classed as a tourist, right? But in fact, you often will be a domestic tourist. In general, domestic tourists are anyone who undertakes travel activities in their own country of residence, i.e. living in London and travelling to Glasgow for the day or for an overnight stay. Have you ever seen the film Into the Wild? This is a great example of domestic tourism, and if you haven't seen it, I recommend you check it out. It's a story of a young guy who sold all of his belongings and hitchhiked through America all the way to Alaska. It's definitely some good Saturday night viewing. And the domestic tourism market is actually really important. But why? According to a recent report published by the World Travel and Tourism Council, domestic tourism accounts for 73% of total travel and tourism spending. That was in 2018, so not long before the pandemic had quite some impact on those figures. Many countries rely on domestic tourism as a tool to reduce poverty, improve infrastructure, generate employment, and most importantly, to drive economic growth. The activities of domestic tourists create economic importance as the money spent on domestic tourism feeds back into the particular country's economy, providing itself with a more viable and prosperous economy. Okay, so domestic tourism is all about staying in your own country and having a look at what's on your doorstep, essentially. But as I said at the beginning, there are some countries that have this more prominently than others. For example, in the United Kingdom, lots of people don't stay in their own country because the weather is less than desirable for lots of people. However, in countries that are bigger and that have more diversity, a lot of people don't feel the need to leave at all. So let's look at a few examples of where we do see domestic tourism and why. Well, my first example is the United Kingdom. Whilst lots of people do flock abroad, lots of people do choose to stay too. And according to Visit Britain, around 100 million domestic overnight trips are taken and 1.4 billion domestic day trips are taken in England each year. The UK's domestic overnight trips reached £20 billion before the pandemic hit, whilst the 1.5 billion domestic day visits reached more than 50 billion in profit, all of which feeds back into the UK economy. Some of the most popular travel attractions for domestic tourists in the UK are the Tower of London, Westminster Abbey, Kew Gardens, St Paul's Cathedral, Chester Zoo, Windermere Boat Cruises, Flamingo Land Theme Park and Zoo, Stonehenge, London Zoo, and Drayton Manor Theme Park. Lots of these locations are actually based in London, which is obviously the capital city of the UK. So most domestic tourism activities in the UK are generally centred around the conservation of either natural or heritage sites or theme parks. We then have domestic tourism in the United States of America. Many people who reside in the USA don't have a passport. And with so much to see and do domestically, it's not surprising that citizens are happy to travel as domestic tourists. Prior to the pandemic, domestic tourists in the USA spent around $950 billion each year, representing almost 90% of total tourism expenditures and supporting almost 8 million jobs. To me, it's no surprise that the domestic tourism industry in the USA is worth so much. Not only is it a huge country with an incredible range of diversity in tourism areas, from the snows of Alaska to the heats of Miami, but there are also many wonderful attractions to visit. The most popular destinations for domestic tourism in the United States are taking an Alaskan cruise, visiting Orlando, Las Vegas, Maui in Hawaii, New York City, Honolulu, also in Hawaii, taking a Hawaiian cruise, Miami Beach in Florida, Washington DC, and Los Angeles. And another country where domestic tourism is huge is India. India is home to some of the most beautiful natural and cultural heritage sites in the world, not only making it a popular destination for international tourists, but also for domestic tourists. According to the World Travel and Tourism Council, domestic tourism spending in India is at around 90%, compared to foreign spending, which is at around 13%. Therefore, domestic tourism in India contributes to approximately 10% of its overall GDP. The top 7 visited states by domestic tourists are Tamil Nadu, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, Maharashtra, and Rajasthan. India is a beautiful country with so much to offer. It certainly has been one of my favourite countries to travel, and I hope to return with my children someday soon. But it's no surprise to see that the domestic tourism industry in India is so significant, given the diversity of attractions and the sheer size of the country. Not to mention that many people living in India can't afford to travel internationally. Domestic tourism is big in South Africa too, and it's actually a growing destination for domestic tourism. The Minister of SA has fostered the National Tourism Sector Strategy, which is a strategy that focuses on domestic tourism and its contribution to a sustainable tourism economy. The number of day trips in South Africa is around 50 million each year, and overnight trips account for around 45 million tourist trips each year. Unlike the other destinations mentioned, South Africa is home to an abundant wildlife and nature reserve sites that attracts domestic tourism. According to the South African Tourism Board, the top destinations in South Africa are Cape Town, the Winelands, the Garden Route, Johannesburg, Kruger National Park, Durban Beachfront, Robben Island, Soweto, Blyde River Canyon Nature Reserve, and the Wild Coast. And the biggest domestic tourism market of all is China. According to the Chinese ministry, domestic tourism generated 5.13 trillion yuan, which equates to $764 billion in revenue pre-pandemic, and this figure was climbing steadily each year. In fact, the Chinese market, both domestically and internationally, has been the fastest growing tourism industry in the world in recent years. According to research by the World Travel and Tourism Council, China has been extremely successful in fostering domestic tourism and is now one of the leading domestic tourism markets in the world. There's a lot of hidden cultural heritage in China that is often overlooked or ignored with its commercialized industry and giant skyscrapers. The red tourism industry is really big too. And, it can be a great thing to explore your own country. And I'm certainly guilty of not exploring the UK enough. As I mentioned, the weather does put me off a bit. But we do have the odd sunny day. Anyway, domestic tourism is great because it often involves less travel, so it can be more environmentally friendly too. And it helps to maximise the economic benefits in your own home country. If you found this video interesting, I have this video here all about more types of tourism that I think you will really enjoy.